Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 238th New Social Environment. I'm Henry Addison, a production assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between Peter Sachs and Phyllis Tuchman. We're also thrilled to have the poet Daniel Bouchard here today, who will read to close our program. To begin, I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation, the traditional owners of Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters on which we stand. The Brooklyn Rail stands in solidarity with the uprisings in response to the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAtee, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy-Fals, Toyin Salau, Walter Wallace Jr., and countless others we have lost to white supremacy and police violence in this country. And we acknowledge that justice will come from the streets, from the nation demanding accountability and refusing to move on until Black Lives Matter in the eyes of the state. And now, before I introduce our host, we'd love to begin with a brief moment of silence. Thank you. And now to introduce today's host, Phyllis Tuchman is a critic and art historian who teaches and writes about art, particularly sculpture. She is taught at Williams College, Hunter College, and the School of Visual Arts. She is currently writing a book on the life and times of Robert Smithson, and she is an editor at large for the Brooklyn Rail. Phyllis, please take it away.
Thank you, Henry. I just would like to make a few, I'm not appearing. Should I be appearing?
We can hear you and see you.
Oh, you can see, okay, because I'm not on my screen. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Brooklyn Rail, lunchtime. Peter Sachs came to painting kind of late, slightly more than 20 years ago. He gave up writing poetry cold turkey and began making art. From the outset, he was practically fully formed like a character from Greek mythology. It helped that he was talented, smart, focused, and dedicated. Previously, he'd kept notebooks that he filled with drawings and observations about things that struck him. And he looked at art the way he'd listened to classical music and read voluminously with an acute intelligence. In just 2 decades, he's achieved what often takes many artists a lifetime to accomplish. Visit his current show at Speroni Westwater, and you'll see for yourself. The paintings and works on paper are both bold and lyrical, formally inventive, and intellectually challenging. I'm a big fan of a review that Ben Lerner wrote for Art in America a few years ago. It shouldn't be surprising that a novelist who's also an art critic responded insightfully to the work of a painter who has published 5 books of poetry and a lauded study of English elegies. Lerner observed, while Sachs handles paint wonderfully, his manipulation and placement of cloth and other objects, and his selection and typing out of texts are at least as important as the application of paint. And yet the works have an unmistakable painterly effect. In a minute, this will all become clear to you as well. With the first slide. So this is just a treat to be able to see Peter in his studio at work, and you have a sense of his scale next to the painting behind him and the triptych to the left. Can we have the next slide? So this is one of the more amazing paintings at Speroni Westwater, Republic. And you see it as soon as you enter the space of the gallery. It's your basic showstopper. And I don't know about many of you, but we don't have showstoppers anymore in art shows. So it's kind of a delight to see. It's almost the sort of painting that Frederick Church would have put on the road. Part of its majesty comes from Republic being a triptych. Peter, you've made a lot of triptychs. Why does this format appeal to you?
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Good. Well, first, thank you for everybody who's attending and to the Brooklyn Rail for setting this up and for all of the support that's gone into this already. And thank you, Phyllis, for these introductions. The triptych has indeed been a staple of my work for decades now. And I think it goes back to my original sense of what is it like to feel in a state of awe in front of an image that seems to contain something absolutely serious, often based on altarpieces, where you feel that you're on the threshold between the human and some other realm. And often there's enormous suffering going on in many of these altarpieces. And so the triptych brought some of that primal template to bear on me, but it also allowed me to try to engage something that would have a narrative element, since often one reads triptychs from left to right, one senses that there's some kind of movement. The question is, what is the relation between the panels? So it raises all kinds of questions that a single panel would not. And I can go into detail as to what kinds of triptychs in the past I've done, or this one in particular, why it might be pertinent that it's in a triptych form. I have to say right away, though, that triptychs and altarpieces, which were expanding the notion of what could be done on an easel, were taking me back to my first experiences of art as such, which were cave paintings. And there's a way, particularly when I'm on a large scale, as in this painting, I feel as if I'm painting something that's more than an art object. I'm painting part of our environment. And indeed, for a painting like Republic, I felt I was trying to represent the atmosphere in which we live, or have lived during these past few years. So there's many reasons for the triptych, but they go back to some very basic sense that you're painting onto something that is more than just an aesthetic surface, that you're painting onto the world in some regards, or onto the walls of a church, or onto the walls of a prison cell. But there is something other than the merely traditionally framed single panel that I think comes into play here.
But they still function as abstractions.
Yes, yes. So the challenge there is, given that I'm working between cave paintings, medieval fresco, the history of abstract expressionism, and the fact that we're in the 21st century, I'm not going to be painting in some traditional form. I've got to invent some new means that can do justice for me to the unprecedented forces of reality around us. And in this case, the abstraction is there because there's no obvious identifiable figures, although I have to say right away that all of my paintings involve many, many layers. And often the figurative subjects of the paintings are buried below the surface. So that, for example, when I began this, not knowing what I was going to do, and it started pretty much at the beginning of this last prior misadministration, I wanted an environment that I could inhabit that would be large enough to record almost on a daily basis my sense of what was going on. So there was an abstraction about feeling that I could layer things down. For instance, the bottom left-hand corner, as we're looking at it, there seems to be a human figure. And indeed, there will be a way in which that becomes a kind of protagonist. There will be shirts which suggest human presences, so that the abstraction is set off by the materiality of certain elements which are identifiable as clothing or domestic embroideries or lace or shirts from other sources. So the abstraction is set off by what I call the traction of real objects. And the site becomes a kind of debris field, a kind of bomb site in which these things seem to be remains that one can take into oneself and respond to in pieces or as a whole. And then the abstraction that you referred to in terms of abstract painting, yes, there will be force lines, there will be elements of composition, there will be large pieces that travel through or across, or even up over the top of, or down below the bottom of the painting, as if the painting is just cut out from so much larger environment. And indeed, while working on this, my studio floor was an entire morass of some of the other ingredients and pieces of cloth or pieces of type fabric that were lying all over the place.
I'm going to ask you a question about the title, but I think we should have the next two slides, which are details, which kind of relate to what you were just talking about. I'd like to ask you about the title Republic, because lots of us grew up singing the battle hymn of the Republic, but obviously you would not have done that. Living and growing up, being raised in another country. What did you have in mind when you called this Republic?
So as with the surface of the painting, there are many layers to an answer to that question. I mean, maybe this is the battle painting of the Republic, as opposed to the battle hymn, although there is language buried in here. And when I grew up in South Africa, obviously it was under the apartheid regime. So the atrocity of political injustice, of racial injustice, the kinds of things that Henry was referring to as a frame for our conversation today, which are very much in my mind and in my heart. When South Africa became a republic, as opposed to part of the British Commonwealth, it was the moment at which nationalist white supremacists were taking power. So there's a kind of shiver that goes down my spine when I think of the Republic of South Africa. It was very much associated with the Afrikaner domination. And I didn't grow up singing the battle hymn of the Republic, but when I became a naturalized American citizen in the 1990s, there was the I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the Republic for which it stands. So my question was, what's the relation between something like a symbol, the flag, and then the actuality of a republic? And I think what I was trying to evoke in this painting is my sense of what the actualities were behind the flag. And when I was speaking of buried figures, I should say that at the very outset, the first things I did with these very large canvases was to start typing out sections of the American Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and then of course the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. And I also put a large burlap, very rugged figure on the left-hand panel that was large, life-size, that was a kind of Statue of Liberty figure. And then my question was, could the Statue of Liberty and Constitution survive what was going to now unfold in the making of this painting, which went on for 2 years? As I added debris, as I scrubbed them out, as I covered them, as I made things disappear and yet seem to loom from below. So there's all of those aspects to it. And so yes, growing up in South Africa, that version of Republic, coming to the United States, thinking that I was coming to a functioning democracy, but realizing I first came here in 67, 68, during the race riots, that democracy didn't mean the disappearance of racism. And so my sense of what these terms are, the semantics are, you've got a republic, but it's not functioning as a democracy. All of those things create a kind of complexity and a layered almost confusion, which I'm sometimes registering at the level of just texture. So that if you look at a detail, it's muddling, it's confusing that there might be precious handmade materials on that right-hand one, for example, and yet there's a bloody smear, or there's a sense of corrugated cardboard, which seems industrial and harsh and has further associations for me with South Africa. So there's no way I can put into language thoroughly good answers to your questions fully. I can just sort of scratch the surface.
Can we have the next the next set of slides? These are also two paintings that are in your show at Speroni Westwater. And I was wondering, after working with monochrome, you had all red paintings, all black paintings, all blue paintings. And also in your last show, there were very busy surfaces. There was so much detail. It was almost overloaded. Why in this show did you do you have so much white ground?
All right, I think that's a terrific question. And I think what was happening as I moved into the paintings of these last 4 years was an attempted simplification in terms of the graphic elements, whereas that simplification would be set off with the complication of the actual textural, tactile materiality of the works themselves. So they might look as if there are few graphic elements in there, but there's about 9, 10, 11 layers of wood, of cardboard, of metal, of all of those kinds of ingredients. And I think there's something more elegiac in these paintings, so that I was feeling, if you ask what is the emotion behind these paintings, they were a combination of rage, outrage, and grief. And they're sort of mourning works, and it's hard to see from this distance, but once one's up close, you do see the outlines of a human shirt, or of a collar, or of sleeves, as if there is a figure that's buried into that surface. And I wanted to keep it relatively simple. In the case of the left-hand one, that simplicity, there's a collar, that vertical column is like a post, but at the top, a collar opens, and inside that collar, there are sleeves that have fists. And it's as if there's an attempt to make that collar, that open throat, speak. And similarly, on the right-hand painting, without name, there's an open collar where the very red, there's a sort of what looks like a flag going down the center. Then almost to the top, the collar opens and some red cloth comes out of it. And then above that, there's a sort of winged finger. But I wanted the white background to suggest a kind of asceticism or severity in these paintings that was equivalent to silence. And I love the fact that our session opened with Henry asking for a minute's silence to acknowledge what is not being seen, what is not being heard. And for me, the white suggests both erasure. It allows things to appear as if they were ghosts coming in from behind, especially in the right-hand painting. But there is, for me, a deep imperative towards silence in these works, so that they can hover there and become increasingly apparitional or haunting, rather than being distracted by a tremendous amount of graphic digressions or diversions. There's also something that allows them to be more statuesque. And I think in the right-hand one, you can see a residue of what had been a columnar shape, not unlike what might have been the pedestal for a statue or a figure of justice. But that got so many times erased and repainted and recovered. And then there's that ghostly hovering form behind it. Hard to make out on the screen, much easier to sense when you're standing in front of it.
We do have one detail coming up. There's a detail.
Yes.
Yeah, the flag.
Good. So that flag goes up the center of, when you're standing in front of the painting, looks like an entire body. And that body is the shape of an actual dress. And that dress, which is of old cotton and linens gathered over the years from as far afield as Normandy, as Africa, as India, has been then pressed down over the relief of what is coming up, pressing up from under it. And on that flag, the loop of the flag suggesting that there's a kind of wind blowing through the canvas. I want these to be at once very still and yet have kinds of mobility within them, as if that could flutter or it could take another form. It's alive somehow. It's a pennant. And as you go up, you're going up the center, and just at the very top of that frame, you can see the beginning of the collar opening out. And that collar has been burned. So these are, we're talking about the battle hymn of the Republic, but these are paintings very much about what survives and what persists, even though it has been damaged. Okay, how do we reconcile injury, damage with persistence or with creating things? There's a painting in which there's just a few words visible. Actually, it's in the big Republic painting typed, which says, I think, something like create, save, and then the word emergency. So this dialogue is going on, and this is just a stakeholder that acts formally, obviously within the center of the painting, but emotionally becomes something that you could imagine grabbing onto, or hoisting, or holding up even after defeat and going on. And so there's a sort of persistence visually, but then for me, psycho-politically even.
And it's so amazing because it's so, the installation at Speroni Westwater is so perfect. The white walls, the way they've been lit, it just brings you exactly to what you've been describing.
Well, I'm grateful for you because I've not, because of this recent injury, been able to get there myself. So I wish I were able to be doing this sort of from within the gallery, but I will get there. I will get there.
Can we have the next two, please?
Uh-huh.
So here we're kind of not quite back at the beginning, but close enough.
That's right.
And I'm interested, after focusing so much on words as a poet, as a writer, you became a painter.
Mm-hmm.
Why? And what made you turn to objects, to pieces of clothing, to corrugated board, to lace, to fabric?
Well, the why is, that would take an hour just to go into the set of determinants on that transformation, because indeed I was sort of halfway through my 6th or 7th book and then had this experience in a state of retreat down in Marfa about 15, 16, 17 years ago, in which I found myself wordless and would just take these long walks 30 miles at a time, day and night, and come to terms with the kind of muteness, which took me back to one of my early poems, which had the line, "If they capture me, I have not learned to speak." As if language was itself had become so complicated in its sense of coding and labeling that I needed a kind of freedom that was nonverbal. And I also wanted a kind of physicality and an immediacy that reading something on the page wasn't giving me. It's another way of saying I just wasn't a good enough poet, but to achieve the kinds of visceral impacts. And you said earlier that the works might be intellectually challenging, but that's way, way down the line. I want them to be viscerally inviting and immediate, and not, they might be challenging in terms of the emotion. For instance, both of these have a kind of aggressive violence that's in them. But the turn from words to objects was a way of trying to reground myself in the given world and actually bring things in, such as clothing, which carried their own associations, or corrugated cardboard, which had its own stubborn, persistent reality. It wasn't like I could just squeeze paint out of a tube or get out of a can. I had to somehow get my hands on the things of this world. And often they were debris, they were refuse, they were things that were being thrown away or had become degraded or ruined, and I would get them at flea markets, or I'd find them in dumps, literally. And so they then became, I felt I had to, can I do justice to those materials? In other words, the large work of what I was thinking myself to be about, which was basically retrieval or recuperation. I mean, I had gone to medical school as a 16-year-old, and I think the idea to have some healing at work or some giving birth to life at work has persisted, but it's taken this very detoured path. And there was a magic to me in materiality itself. Things could become other things. They were metamorphic. In other words, it wasn't just one word image would give to another word image. It's that, for instance, in the left-hand panel, that whole top archway, which looks like a Romanesque or a pre-Gothic arch, is actually just made out of cardboard, which has then been heavily painted over and had cloth put over it. But there was a fascination for me with how materials can turn into other materials if you revision them, if you reimagine them. And it was a way of getting me out of my cerebral mind into my body and into my hands. So that one on the left is quite old. It goes back, I began it in 2003. Some of these were responding to the Iraq War and then subsequently to Abu Ghraib. And the one on the left, I was suggesting a kind of church-like interior, or possibly a sort of altarpiece, but that's a burnt shirt with a burnt collar at the top, and those two black columns are, well, for me, they could be parts of a prayer shawl, but there's many associations. It's partly what the abstraction for me does, is to invite a plurality of responses, primarily emotional responses. Is there something sacred there, or is that just a ruin, or both, or how those might interrelate? Whereas the one on the right, which is when I was still using a tremendous amount of typing, that central, what looks like rectangle, is completely covered very, very densely with hand-typed on a manual typewriter texts from the Book of Job and from Dante's Inferno, which is why the top of the oblong seems to be almost on fire, as if the head is on fire. But then right inside, as you get up close, you could be reading the entire texts of the Book of Job or of Dante's Inferno. So that was a transitional moment, Phyllis, because I was able to marry text to texture, right? Text to object. And I think, does that answer the question?
Well, I'm thrilled because my next question was going to be about texture.
Oh, right. Well, let's remember it's the same word, right? Going back to the Greek for weaving, but a text and a textile and texture, they're all the same. And language is a kind of fabric. And in these paintings where fabric is so at risk and yet possibly redemptive, I think texture is a real protagonist. It's not just a feature.
Oh, it's amazing how you do that.
But go ahead with the question.
No. Yeah, you had answered it. So I was so intrigued you brought it up before I asked it. Can we have the next two, please? So you were working at a certain point. This was one of your first shows in New York. You were working with monochrome.
Yes.
Is this an assertion that you were making a painting?
Yeah, in a way, in my relatively early years of making particularly larger works, I really wanted to explore the entire vocabulary of abstract painting. And that included exploring how rich I could make what would otherwise just be a color field painting. So what happens when you integrate texture, embroideries? This has a lot, it's hard to make out, a little easier to make out on the right hand, the blue one. That there's large swatches of clothing and embroidery and tablecloths and all kinds of things underneath there. But I really was trying to get a sense of what is color and what is its emotional affordances and invitations, and what would an all over painting feel like when it was primarily monochromatic. It had the other effect, which was allow me to really enter one element, so to speak. Let's say the element of fire or of blood in the left, or the element of the night sky, or perhaps even the deep ocean on the right. And so I was looking for works that would allow immersion as if you were immersing yourself, not just in a scene, but in an element, okay? So while working on the right-hand one, it was almost as if I needed to put on my diving goggles and go into it, or get a telescope and look out into its depths. So I was exploring surface and depth, and somehow using the monochrome made that emphatic, because you couldn't use obvious means of foreground, background, surface depth. You had to allow it all to seem to happen within that same color. So it was a kind of challenge. It was a deep learning experience, although it was a real emotional support as well. And the right-hand one, Orion, of course, is a great constellation, and it's one of those constellations, unlike the Southern Cross, which exists in both hemispheres. It's just that it exists in the Southern Hemisphere in the summer and the Northern Hemisphere in the winter. But when I immigrated to this country, it became a kind of companion, as it has been to so many people across so many civilizations, you know, ancient Greek, Phoenician, Arab, African. And there's a wonderful poem by Adrienne Rich, which is just called Orion, in which she speaks to the constellation, and she addresses it as her fierce half-brother, and says, "What are we doing out here breathing the cold air, you with your back to the wall?" And I just love that image of however far out you go in space, if you're making a painting, it's going to eventually be, you'd have to take account of the fact that there's finitude there. You know, the great Orion, in 100,000 years' time, the right shoulder of Orion is going to explode. It's a red supergiant. So whereas the bottom left foot is going to explode as a blue supergiant. So the crazy temporality, you get lost in time for me with these monochromes. The one on the left was called Mars, of course, and I have text underneath there from the Iliad. And again, it was during the Iraq War, so there was stuff that I then buried as if in blood, or as if under the color of fire.
And perfect for today. I mean, I read the article in the Times about our exploration of Mars.
Oh.
I mean, it's kind of very topical.
Yeah.
How many did you paint, like orange or yellow or green?
Yes, I have a huge orange triptych that's called actually Purgatorio, which is a human figure completely on fire, with the text of Dante's Purgatorio typed all across his body. And so orange was a crucial figure, just as a kind of beige became a crucial figure. I did a large painting that was drawing on the Geneva Conventions and the report of the International Red Cross, which I wanted to make it seem as if it was on tablets of ancient stone, like the epic Gilgamesh, which we read on, you know, just tablets of sandstone. So I wanted that color into work. So yes, there's a tremendous versatility amongst these. I did an all green one that was based on my journeys in the Amazon when I was in my 20s. So yeah, there's quite a range of those.
Peter, did you are these the colors you would get from a bottle? Did you mix the colors? Are they American colors or European colors?
That's a great question. These actually, given when I was painting them, I was making them in Normandy, and I was using Sennelier, but which are very high quality art products, but I was choosing acrylics, and in some passages oil for more translucency. But so they're French acrylics, but then now in the past 10 years, I've been using American acrylics, or, you know, products like Utrecht and Golden and so on.
Wow. Can we have the next set, please? Oh.
Yeah.
So, oh no, I wanted summoning. Peter.
Yes.
Sometimes your titles are verbs, sometimes they're nouns, and
yes.
How do you have the title before the series, or the series and then the title?
No, it's usually several paintings that are following each other and then seeming suggest that there might be something larger going on here, and then a title might emerge. I mean, the title for Republic emerged after at least about a year.
Oh, wow.
In which I don't know what I'm doing until fairly late on. So titling comes in For instance, those two paintings that you showed earlier on, one is called No Name and the other is Without Title. The whole question of titling is very loaded for me. And I like the fact that you mentioned verb and noun, because in this particular sequence of summonings, as with the one that you showed before with the Romanesque arch and the figure with black stripes down, I did feel that the paintings were summoning you to a particular region, not just to a particular object. And in fact, you can almost see a ghostly room within the room here. Is that a corridor that we're being summoned down? And again, it was a painting that was very haunted by what was going on at the time. And it was an environment which, instead of being like Mars, which was apparently impenetrable, this one felt atmospherically penetrable, as if you could actually move in there and keep breathing, however painful or challenging that might be.
Wow, yeah, it's you're such a great guide to your art. This has been
the other way around. I have to stress that it is absolutely the other way around. And part of the reason I turned to making visual art was to let the art lead the way, not me so much. Right?
I know, but I've known you for so long. I'm really enjoying this enormously. May I have the next set?
Yeah.
So you've referred again and again to the texts.
Yes.
That you have incorporated. I feel that Scott must have something to do with Antarctica, and that's why it's blue.
Yes.
And then Necessity 31, we obviously have this garment here.
Yes.
How important is reading the text?
It's an invitation to those who initially I want to respond to the work as if there were no text. Those are just shapes on the wall. And because of the way they're made, because of the texture, the layering, the invitation is there to come up closer just to see what the surface is composed of. And only then might one discover that there are indeed also words written into that matrix. And so they're sort of secondary, and you're not meant to be sitting there and reading them as if they were a book or something written on the wall. You're meant to catch phrases. You're meant to get a sense that there's parts of it that are illegible, that this is a fragment of maybe some much larger set of writings. And so it's important, but it's not primary. And in the Scott, for example, that is meant to be a version of the outline of Antarctica, even as I was very aware of the ways in which Antarctica is disintegrating and melting away. So within that white mass, which just looks like a white mass of an ice sheet, is micrographically written, tiny microscopic script of my own handwriting in which I copied out Scott's journals, because I felt that what we're doing to Antarctica and indeed to the planet now is a kind of horrendous continuum of man's urge to not just explore, but somehow dominate, chart, let's be the first to get to the South Pole. What is that spirit, and what is its potentially harmful and in this case, absolutely self-destructive, since he died trying to get back to shelter. But I was making his journey as if word by word across that continent, with all of its ridges and crevasses and places of frozenness. So it was a surface in which Scott's journals could come to life or come to death, but really as impacted within their environment, rather than, I'd read them as a young person. And when I was young, Scott was some kind of heroic figure. Whereas afterwards, it became much more complicated as I read through the entire journals.
And the triptych on the bottom?
Well, that's from a series of triptychs which were in homage to particular figures. Whether it was, I have one that's in homage to Primo Levi, one that's several that are in homage to Paul Celan. This one has some of Celan's writings. There's others that have large sections of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. There's another with Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism. But these are residual phrases that just you know, a lot of it's been put down and then completely scrubbed out or painted over or had layers of cloth put over as if I were burying something in there, partly to protect it and partly because I was troubled by the ways in which voices keep getting erased.
Well, Peter, I was also wondering, with the one on the bottom, Necessity 31 in that garment,
Yes.
you have a real gift for working with formal properties, but you also have this amazing knowledge of poetic devices. So how important is something like metonymy? Do you feel you have a bigger vocabulary because some things come from art and some things come from literature?
Yeah, I don't want to overstress the coming from literature. And in fact, I have a much broader definition of what I think poetry is, you know, going back to the origins of the word, which is just making. But when you raise a word like metonymy, of course, I think from having spent a lot of time with literature, especially poetry, I'm very aware of what might be metaphorical or what might be not just metaphorical, but metonymical. Metonymical in this case, in which a garment stands for an actual body and is part of some larger, much larger fabric, the part standing in for the whole by its association, quite physically, quite literally. And I think poetry has just been, it's part of my life, it's part of my inner life. And it connects me to various things that I might not otherwise have had exclusively coming from an art background.
I know, it's kind of amazing you didn't go to art school.
No, but I spent more time in art history classes than I did in literature classes, whether I was taking them or just auditing them. And I've certainly spent more time taking notes on paintings than I have on taking notes on literature. So I've got shelves of notebooks, handwritten books about particular paintings or particular works of art.
Are there any particular museums that have meant more to you?
Well, you know, I would say, going back to how I began, the first museum was a cave, and these were caves in South Africa. And so I think of those as the Museum. And then places that were, I mean, there's great museums that have been absolutely crucial, both sanctuaries and provocations to me. And whether it's, you know, moving from within this country, the Met, obviously with its encyclopedic collection, so that I could immerse myself in not just many cultures, but many eras. But I've spent unforgettable time in the Uffizi or in the Prado, or when I was in Vienna at the Kunsthistorische Museum, or obviously in Berlin. And then some very small museums, which might have something like one painting that I will just spend a lot of time in Krakow. For instance, there's a very small museum, but it's got a Leonardo. And it's a remarkable painting.
Oh.
And one can enter into a kind of hallowed relationship, which is different from what you might get in the Louvre, right? Even though what could be more thrilling than to move around the Louvre. So yeah, there's many museums. And I think the idea of the museum is something that we're constantly trying to widen. I mean, I'm very moved and very struck by the museum that Brian Stevenson has been creating, which is a more kind of living testimonial notion of a museum. Yes, there's poetry there, but there's also an attempt to be curating the world or curating history. And I think that's one of the challenges for art museums, is how to keep curating the ratio between the art object and the history in which it has been formed and is continuing to live.
Oh my God, I know. And we have such a gift at the Met with the director who comes from Frankfurt and just, you know, brings a whole nother aesthetic, which is very needed. Can we have the next? I believe it's migration coming up.
Well, sorry, did you have a question regarding these, or should I just say?
Well, one question was going to be about migration, was going to be about Kafka, and another question was going to be about Durban. But Kafka's meant a lot to you, I gather.
Yeah, the very first work that I made that included text happened almost without my understanding what I was doing. I just had the urge, and this goes back to your question about how did you move from writing to painting. I was so gripped by the section of his novel, The Trial, which is a section called Before the Law, that I just thought, I'm going to just get a long strip of linen. I was in Normandy and got an old piece of linen that had been repaired and broke, had all the stitch work in it. And I ran it through this old typewriter and I just started typing it out, and typed out this long 6-foot stretch of linen and laid it on the floor and left it there, and then came back the next morning and it was as if there was a ghost lying on the floor, or a human form, or a shroud, or a figure. And I thought, wait a minute, the text has turned into a kind of human trace. And what if I've now put that onto a canvas and now put it vertically on the wall? And then this creature of words was standing there and became a sentinel, a kind of a ghost, but a companion. And I've gone back to Kafka over and over. It takes a very long time, obviously, to type things out on an old typewriter. We're not talking about an electric typewriter even, because you're hammering the iron keys into the cloth and you're rolling it as you go. And in these cases, the cloth is then being bent over corrugated surfaces, and it's getting distorted and warped and made less legible. But I then went on and made an entire sequence of 66 works that were based on Kafka's Trial, in which I typed out the novel, and that took 8 years. So there's a kind of deranged dementia of commitment in some of these works, whereas the one on the right is up to different things, and the texts that are in there have been completely buried by blue paint, and they had to do with the Indian Ocean and just my love for the sea.
Yeah, well, you're bringing up the Indian Ocean, and one of the things I find amazing is, when you talk about American artists, it's like East Coast, West Coast, Atlantic Ocean,
Yes.
Pacific Ocean, but you're like coming from the Indian Ocean.
That's so true.
And this raises an even bigger question. Are you an African artist?
I say absolutely yes. In terms of what has given rise to my origins as a sensibility and as a conscience, but I have lived in this country and I'm a naturalized American. And as Henry Louis Gates likes to say to me, hey man, you're more African American than I am. And there's a kind of joke that goes on there, but I think my identity is very much a fusion. It's split between an African self, but even that African self is only 1 or 2 generations deep, because behind that goes my Lithuanian Jewish grandparents who immigrated to South Africa. So I can't identify as simply, perhaps that's why these paintings are so layered. I feel that my own identity, if there's a flag, it's a flag on top of a prior flag on top of a prior flag. And to do justice to that involves the layering or the roughening up of the surface. And the Indian Ocean is, of course, it's neither the Atlantic nor the Pacific. It runs in and meets the Atlantic at the bottom of the Cape. And it's obviously a remarkable geographical and historical site, but let's not go into that now, except to say that the painting on the right is full of currents and a sense of things under the water moving and stirring. So it's a place of refreshment for me, but it's much more enveloping. It's almost like the blue of the night sky in Orion.
Definitely. Can we have the next 2, please?
These are actually there we go.
So here we really have, the text is so much more obvious.
Yes.
And the surface is becoming much more cluttered. How do you develop new themes?
It's just experiential. It's what's occupying me at the time. You know, whether it's that day's outrage, as we've been suffering these several years, which will send me into the studio in a state of despair or grief, and will bring a kind of violence even to the making, in which I'll say, God damn it, here I'm burning this piece now, or here I'm just going to glue this, you know, this chunk of wood down here ruthlessly, put some, even though I spent a long time typing something, I'm going to rip it, I'm going to tear it, so what gives rise to these paintings is diurnal, or often it's my nightmares, but then there's the longer surviving fidelities or companionships that I've had over time with certain works or certain texts, which I then put into rough combinations, so that the one on the right, what looks fairly even, typed down the left-hand side of it in a column, is actually a poem. It's a translation of the poem of Osip Mandelstam's called The Slate Ode, and a poem he wrote, and we can go into why he is such an important figure for me. But I do have these witness figures, whether it's Celan or Primo Levi or Mandelstam or Akhmatov or others, and I do want to type out their work as if by a kind of ritual of bringing them into my own body, putting them out there, having them be in a place that's not just a page, but is part of the visual world around us. And these are small paintings, okay? They're 20 by 20 inches. And so I wanted a kind of intimacy about them, as if I were making illuminated manuscripts in some newfangled way. And had the way in which illuminated manuscripts were such treasures, with their combination of image and then carefully written calligraphy and often commentary. And I wanted that sense of these being, in a way, pages, but pages that are now loaded, laden physically with gravity of an almost unbearable kind, so that they have weight. And they're like blocks that I quarry out of, I suppose, you know, my inner and outer environment.
Wow. And that is a shoe in the left, right? In the bottom right of it just looks like a shoe.
I know it looks like a shoe, but you know, that's the advantage of working very slowly, where things morph. At a certain point, there was a kind of ship-like form there. And then it became like a boot, and then it became like a piece of geography, and then it became a medley of those things, where you will see a shoe, but somebody else might see the hull of a sailing boat that's disintegrating, or others might just see something altogether different, a mere form with yellow and white stripes in it.
And in the top right corner of Road to the Interior 14,
yes,
we've seen details with lace.
Correct.
Do you want people to look through the lace? Is it a cubist idea? Is it lace is something you just don't, it's like from everybody's, it's from a long ago time.
Yes. Well, there is a way in which I am trying to paint time in these paintings, not just paint space. And so by using something that is as old and as handmade as lace, particularly the pieces that I was finding in Normandy, some of which would go back to the 18th century, you'd find them in scraps and in debris. People didn't know what to do with them. They sensed that they were precious, but they had no life for them. Sometimes they get sent to me. People send me things and they say, I've seen your work. Maybe you can find this has sentimental value, but it has no actual value. And I'm gonna have to throw it out. It belonged to my grandparents, but I have nothing I can do with it. So lace carries a lot of emotional freight for me, civilizational freight for me. And I like juxtaposing it with things that are the obverse of lace, such as buried in that painting are just pieces of wood. You know, which don't seem to be highly precious or worked, and bits of cardboard and so on. And yes, you can see through it in some instances. And yes, it might suggest certain ways of early cubism. I mean, I love the way in which early cubist paintings used cane, for instance, cane chairs that it would create a matrix. You could sort of see through it, but but also you couldn't.
kind of amazing to just see all these images brought together in sequence. Can we have the next
Kind of
one?
amazing for me. I should say that there's a lot of just casualties that occur in the making. And as I'm looking, because I haven't seen these put together like this ever, but on the right-hand one, upside down, I'm making out the letters NY. And I'm realizing that that must be the inverted side of a piece of cloth that I had hung over a painting saying this thing is destined, this one has to go to New York. So it was instructions to packers saying these are for New York. So I'm often picking up and reusing things that are just lying around in the studio. And there's usually mountains of these things.
I love it. No, once remember I ran into you in Chelsea and you had a big bag of
oh yeah
materials you had just gotten, and it was considerable.
Yeah.
Can we have the next? And this is bringing us back to the current show.
Yes.
Again, a showstopper, which you see from a distance on the second floor at Speroni Westwater. I'm reminded a bit of the Bayeux Tapestry,
Mm-hmm.
and I had experienced it so many years ago when it was just basically wrapped around a schoolroom. I got to see the way it is now, and it's kind of ruined for me. I'm struck by the small panels you have at the top, all
Yeah.
of those vessels.
Yes.
Now, is it difficult for you to adjust to a new scale? You're working large in Republic, and now all of these, they're almost, they're tiny panels.
Yeah, each one is only 10 inches by 10 inches. But there's something really exhilarating for me in moving from very large to very small. It gets back to this idea of the page or something with which you have a very intimate relationship. But in a painting like this, I had no idea what I was going to be doing. I just started making a few blocks that had these ships in them. And I didn't know, were these Phoenician ships, were these Arab ships, were these Greek ships like out of the Iliad? I was thinking about refugees trying to cross the Mediterranean in makeshift craft. And so there was a sort of trans-historical sense of just the basic thing is what is a sailing boat or what is a boat? And I just made one after another, and they would be caught up in different winds. Some would be calm, some would be rough. I had no real idea how many there would be. And then I started realizing, well, you can't just paint what's above the surface, you have to paint what's below the surface. So then I started conjuring the kind of thing that would be underneath the painting, the blue painting Durban, let's say. But this is now the sea life below the surface, which is writhing, which has corals, which has weeds, which is full of uncontrollable vitality, but yet which, as we know, is endangered. So the vivacity and the color and the life of that was something that I wanted to bring into relation to what is above the surface, the ships. In some ways, the above the surface is like my conscious mind, and the below the surface was as if it was my unconscious mind, which is why there's various things buried in those blocks, such as, you know, images of Abraham Lincoln or of Mandelstam or of others who you might think of as who lie on the seabed of history, but who are as important to me as anything above the surface.
Is there text? Is text still included in a work like this?
Yeah, but much less. And in some cases, it's just handwriting. And it just might be a few phrases. And it might have to do with whomever I happen to be reading or involved with at that time, or who has, I mean, there are sections of the Iliad given the catalog of ships. But then I would be copying out some lines by Cavafy or by Elizabeth Bishop, you know, and there would just be traces of those phrases there. But those are almost private. And then if a viewer comes up, which happens much more often than I would have expected, and they will just uncannily be drawn to something and they'd say, oh my God, that's the face of so-and-so, or that's the profile of, there's a torn $5 bill in there. What's that doing in there? And then, you know, how do you incorporate something like that with what looks like a much more wide historical, geographical expanse?
Amazing. Can we have the next one? I'm sort of hoping my computer is not going to die because I still have the problem that I broke this before we began. So this is, we're back to Republic.
Good.
We're back to the beginning.
Yes, good.
Okay, Peter, like Mark Bradford, you're making paintings without paint.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, that's kind of astonishing that you can make a showstopper like this without paint. How did this arise?
Okay, so we looked at some paintings like the red one, the blue one, or earlier ones where there was a tremendous amount of paint covering the whole surface. And there is still paint in places in this painting. There's some blue paint, there's some red paint, there's some white paint. I could actually point them out. But you're completely right that what's happening here is it's as if I'm trying to expose the materials themselves and seeing how can they make the painting? How can it be done by other means? And in this case, it allowed me to dwell with the materials, thinking of them as leading the way, rather than paint, which seems to have to obey the gesture, whether it's Jackson Pollock throwing it or Rothko, emplaning it. But in this case, letting the materials speak for themselves seemed to be important for a painting that was going to eventually be called Republic, after all. I mean, the word Republic goes back to the idea of things, affairs, matters that are in the public domain. And I wanted the matter of the painting to have priority rather than some mere rendering, referencing of it. Let the shirt itself be making the gesture. Let the figure on the bottom left-hand corner, which seems to be a potentially human form being blown sideways or being dragged sideways or pulling on what you can't quite make out, which is a very heavily embroidered fringe there. Is she weaving the tapestry? Is she a Penelope figure? But in fact, as I dwelt with the painting, she became much more associated in my mind with a figure more like Harriet Tubman, and the idea of somebody who's conducting what then becomes a kind of underground railroad that goes off below the surface of the painting, but maintains a kind of riverine shape, making its way over to the right. So the allowing of things to be themselves, so to speak, but take on new meanings because of how they are juxtaposed was an incredible challenge. And that blue turquoise, for the longest time, I thought there's no way that can remain in the painting any more than the Statue of Liberty could remain as it was, although you can sort of make it out when you're close up to the painting. Or the flag-like form on the right-hand column. There's things that disappeared, came back, and those, I'm wearing a shirt that's not unlike the shirts that are in these panels, but it was as if I was putting myself in there. So it wasn't a self-portrait by painting my likeness. It was by actually putting my worn, torn, burned, buttons and all, vestments right there.
Wow, Peter, we've kind of covered what I have. My computer hasn't died yet, although
I have no idea what the time is.
No, we're perfectly timed here. We're going to open up for questions, and I'm going to toy with seeing if I can get the computer plugged in.
Hello, everybody. I see faces now.
Is Henry doing the questions? Who's doing the questions here?
Yeah, I can take it from here. But firstly, thank you so much, Peter and Phyllis. You are both excellent guides to Peter's work, and it's great to see it and hear you in conversation.
Well, thank you, but deep thank you to those people who are tuning in.
Yeah, well, let's go to them. We're going to begin with the fantastic Len Crawford. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
I might not see everybody because my screen only contains a certain number of people. Oh, there.
Hi. This was wonderful. I'm going to try to string together a question, but it's probably going to be cloaked in a comment. I love how you typed out the text of Kafka.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me think it's possibly connected to this idea of how an explorer tries to, like when you were talking about all the voices that were erased.
Yes.
If you can't, if you say you can capture those voices, that's a fallacy. If you don't try, that's a failed quest. But what strikes me about your project is it's neither a failed quest or a triumphant quest, but the act of trying,
yes.
the act of thinking is what is what you dwell in. And it's incredibly inspiring. And is
that's deeply accurate to my sense of a kind of standoff between these two impulses of recognizing damage or injury or erasure on the one hand, and yet desperately, emphatically, letter by letter, in the case of the Kafka, putting my body's weight into trying to maintain a trace of it. So that there are paintings as traces, as testimonies, just as ancient cave paintings are, in a way, not just representations of animals, but they're traces of the people who once inhabited those areas. And so the standoff, as with Republic, between grief and a persistent determination that we will not give in, we will not be completely erased, but how can I portray something that is partially erased or is in danger constantly of being suppressed, silenced, erased, killed, given no breath? Can you make a painting that seems to still have the capacity to open up? And when I was asked about the effect of having been interested in poetry, or remaining interested in poetry, we were thinking of metonymy metaphor, but I think basically what I would say is what poetry gave me was a sense that there is this thing called voice. Mm-hmm. And if the paintings can have voice, even if that voice is partially stifled, it might have an eloquence that it wouldn't have if it was just uninhibitedly, articulately, making a monologue. There's something about words getting caught up and strangled, and that became much more expressive to me, especially over these past several years.
Well, it's interesting.
So thank you, Lynn, for that question, and definitely for Kafka. I should mention the penal colony, which is, of course, the incredible story in which the text gets horribly engraved into his back. But go ahead.
I was just going to say, so what strikes me is perhaps partly your exploration is what do you do with empathy? When you're interested in something and you're devoted to somehow acknowledging it in a way that pays tribute, but how do you do that? It's a deft balance you strike, and I'm deeply moved by it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I would just say there that I think materiality, texture has been crucial to my sense of how do you represent, not represent, but how do you embody empathy? Because after all, the part of our brain that registers empathy is actually wired neurologically to our fingertips. And it's the same, our apparatus has got so many interfering matrices, but it's very, very much the case that when we say a word like, I find that very touching or untouched, that we're actually meaning something quite serious about how empathically we can be moved by touch. And after all, we begin that way. And I think there was just recently a study of what skin is and how much people are deprived in the COVID period of lockdown of touch and of making physical contact with others and what that's doing to their actual brains and their nervous system and their moods. Because the skin is, after all, an organ. We keep thinking, oh, organs are just things like your heart. But the skin is the largest organ of the human being. And, if you flayed a person, there'd be 8 pounds of stuff there, and it would cover about 22 square feet. So in some ways, I think of my paintings as skins that are empathetically loaded with the desire for, the distress of, the love for a vulnerable, tactile entity, not just a painting on a wall.
Mm. You just brought up something that has always intrigued me. Nobody ever gives George Segal credit for the touch of making the plaster figures and the touch of how he touches us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so thank you. It's just one of those little things that's always bothered me.
Yeah, but I think empathy is, it's a word that's being so used and is so capable of being shallowed out, that's been a large motive for my trying to corporealize the embodiment of empathy rather than the reference to it.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for the question. And yeah, I would just say that with all these textiles and materials that lie close to the skin in your work, you definitely get the sense that there's at least the memory of another person's touch.
Yeah.
Can I ask Peter another question?
Well, maybe there's others too. I think there might be a queue here, Phyllis.
Well, we can go to
I'm jumping
Phyllis.
the queue because my computer is not, I just was able to reconnect it.
Okay.
Peter, in lockdown, have you watched a lot of movies? I mean, how have you been affected? How has your art been affected by lockdown?
It's certainly drove me inwards, but I work from a very inward place in the first instances. I'm not a gregarious, socializing person living in an urban world with a lot of interchanges. So I live in my studio basically, and that, always for many years now, I'm sort of 12 hours, 14 hours of the day in the studio. So just in terms of day to day, it didn't affect, but emotionally, it certainly drove me to make my work, what I was speaking about a moment ago, make contact in a way that would be very visceral, very meaningful, very tactile, and very physical. So there was a kind of added urgency that went into it, along with the grief and the rage at the maladministration of what we've been suffering through in relation to that too. So lockdown, the past 3 months I've been somewhat compromised by an injury that I had in November, but the work has been tremendously sustaining given that condition.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for the ad hoc question. So now we are going to go to my fellow production assistant, Anya Bernstein. You should be able to unmute.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you, Peter and Phyllis, for this conversation. It's been so wonderful. I'm just thinking about paintings from Republic and about this idea of what survives and persists, and that abstraction is a zone of debris, which I find really interesting. So I'm thinking about debris and destruction. You've also related your abstraction to elements like fire and water, and elements, of course, are often paired with these premonitions of destruction, especially in excess, as in the bright blue and red of visitation. So I'm wondering, is destruction a methodology that's meaningful or clarifying for you?
Well, it certainly is one way. The fact that I'm often using pieces that are distressed already, that have been stained, that have been thrown away, that have been torn, that have destruction already in them. There's an invitation to me to sort of rescue or redress. I sometimes think of my works as a combination of wound and bandage at the same time, or wound and dressing. And so when you invoke much larger questions, water or fire, I'm aware of the fragility, not just of an individual mortal, but the fragility of our planet. And that's why that painting of Antarctica, for instance, is really quite specific. But in general, when you're in front of an abstract painting and where you're therefore invited to use your associations more than your identifying cognitive intellect, say, oh yeah, that's a branch, that's a tree, that's a chair, that's a person. It's there that you can bring to bear the inchoate notions or responses that you have of maybe our vulnerability or our culpability when it comes to destruction. And so these things are very much there, but not in my brain. They're as much in my fingers, millimeter by millimeter, as I lay the next thread or weave the next combination or tie the next knot.
Great. Thank you, Anya, for the question. I'd love to jump in here if that's all right with my own question.
Of course.
Forgive the impoverished art history, but as I understand it, you know, in like the 50s and 60s, the notion of the picture plane in abstraction was something like relatable to a tabletop or something that kind of accumulates
That's right.
objects. And I'm curious, you've said that, I mean, you've described some of your abstraction as Anya said, a zone of destruction or debris. And you said that your work is responsive to the Iraq War or
Yes.
to, you know, climatological crisis. And I'm curious about over your career and then also over the last few decades, how have you felt the picture plane of your work has changed and the assumptions that you're making with your abstraction, if that makes sense?
Well, it's a great question. It goes back, indeed, as you're saying. I think it was Leo Steinberg who came up with the idea of the flat bed. Phyllis might correct the terminology here.
Frashberg's bed.
Yeah, and that instead of just a plain canvas, you've got this. It's almost like a tray into which you are placing the ingredients of the painting. And you were mentioning destruction, and others were too. But I would love to at least say that there's a tremendous amount of joy that goes into making some of these that have to do with play and discovery and surprise and the unexpected and things. Oh, I didn't know that was in there too, or could be. So they're not exclusively mournful. They're meant to be celebrating just as much as they are grieving. And I think the picture plane, yeah, it's very interesting for me because, Henry, I do work both on the floor for a large period of the making of the work, where I'm above it, and I'm allowing gravity to hold the objects down as they adhere. And I'm in that aerial perspective. But then I will also then, for the last sort of 3/4, which might take months, have it vertically on the wall so that I'm experiencing it both from above and from this lateral plane. So I don't think it's changed that much for me. This has been something that has been there from the get-go. I mentioned that first Kafka experience of just laying out 6 feet of typed cloth on the floor and then thinking, wait a minute, that might not just be a corpse or a mummy, but if it stood on the wall, it could be a ghost with a kind of life. So this idea of the picture plane is huge.
Well, thank you for speaking to that.
Yeah.
We're now going to go to Judith Stein.
Yes.
You should be able to unmute yourself, Judith.
Yes. Oh, this has been just a wonderful conversation. Hi, Phyllis, and just cannot wait to see your show and get my nose in your paintings, because I think much of the pleasure is going to be from just getting as close as possible. So here's my question. In our culture, textiles and fabric are coded female. And it was the artists of the 70s who kind of took that and either became a proud act or a defiant act. And you had artists as different as the feminist artists like Mimi Shapiro or Joyce Kozlov, or the pattern and decoration artists, Lucas Samaras, Robert Kushner. Yes. Is there anybody, when you come across their work from the 70s who you feel a kinship with, or in any kind of a relationship to?
I'm glad you brought that up, because there is a strong affinity that I do feel with a certain tradition and category of making, and certainly quilts and what they have represented, particularly in the middle of the 19th century, have been crucial. But as for particular, sometimes they're collectives who've made things that I've admired a great deal. The AIDS quilt obviously was a huge factor in terms of seeing what could be made. But I don't want to say that it's an exclusively female. In Africa, a lot of the weavers and the people who use textiles are men too. And I think what I liked about working with them is it allowed me to somehow be both. It was strange. It's a deep question, but I can't do it justice now. Doris Salcedo from Colombia is an artist who means a lot to me, who works with a variety of things, including fabric.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Judith, for the question. It was
Thank you,
lovely to hear from you. We are now going to go to another fellow production assistant, Ty. You should be able to unmute.
Hi, first I just want to say thank you, Peter and Phyllis, for such a lovely talk and for bearing with me on the slides. And my question is, Peter, at the beginning of the talk, you said that you wanted an environment that you could inhabit.
Yes.
And I was really interested in that. And I was thinking about and wondering how your inclusion of language, and as you said, language meant to be glimpsed or seen in pieces and not like sat with and read, and how that relates to that feeling of wanting to inhabit a space. And then also in that vein, how does mythology or persona enter your work, and what kind of texts are you most drawn to?
Well, I've mentioned some of the texts, whether it's Primo Levi or Celan or the Geneva Conventions or the report of the International Red Cross or Virginia Woolf or Hannah Arendt, or there's just many, many figures. But I think when I say inhabit and the urge to bring the text off the page into some other entity has meant that what if language was around us in the room that we inhabited? Yes, it might be silent, but there was a kind of silent soundscape in which our remembered voices or the ghosts or the things that have said by those who are not right here, but are nevertheless hanging in the air. How can I bring those into material presence? And so language is not something set apart from life or the world or just materiality. I like to think of it in my work as being part of the very fiber that we make ourselves and unmake ourselves with on a daily basis. And I could certainly go on and on into the kinds of authors, whether it's Abby Warburg or the crazy Judge Schraber, or why Virginia Woolf, why Hannah Arendt, and so forth. The initial moments, as I said, with Republic, I was just typing out the Constitution, as if one had to do that to somehow cling to it and make sure that it was real, and not just words that could be traduced and trashed. And I did this for the Constitution of South Africa, which of course developed one of the most advanced progressive constitutions in any country in the world because of it happening relatively late. So in 1994, the South African Constitution was so moving, so advanced in its thinking in a post-racial society that or at least the attempt to arrive at one where human rights were being broadened, that I felt the urge there to type that whole thing out as well. And indeed, that painting hangs in the Constitutional Court in Johannesburg now. So it's a matter of wanting us to feel that language is right here around us. It's not over there in a book exclusively. I love books, right? But I love the idea that we could be walking into a room and my God, the walls could be speaking to us if we could read them, if we could listen to them. That's why I like them to be my surfaces to be so eroded, as if they've got a story to tell, even if it's one of decay. And if you think back in civilization, after all, Egyptian writing was not in books. They were on large expanses of walls or cuneiform, be large tablets of stone, and you could walk along a wall and you'd read something, whether they were chronicles or sacred scripts. So I'm trying to restore some of that role and power, but also vulnerability to language as part of our world. And I might say it's part of my resistance to the virtualizing of language and the mere digitalization of language, where it seems to be thinning out all the time. This is my attempt to thicken language.
Thank you,
I was
Let's
just
go
gonna say
ahead. Oh, thank you. No, thank you for the question. I mean, we just got, I mean, on a similar note, we just got a question from Asher in the chat, whose microphone is broken. So I'm going to read it on their behalf. Thanks for a fantastic session and for all the great insight. I would love to hear how religion and faith has manifested itself in different ways throughout Peter's work, and how that has changed over time. And maybe what we were just saying about sacrality might be relevant here.
Yeah, okay, so this is of course a colossal question. And I would have to say that I'm somebody with a tremendous religious impulse, but with very little religious faith. In other words, a great desire to feel reverence, wonder, gratitude, the sense that there might be something transcendent or metaphysical, but I've never been able to correlate that with an orthodox formulation of a God or a system of worship. And I might be drawn more to mystics than to organized systems of belief. But I would say that I do not discount my openness to the sacred. I mentioned it before with that those summonings paintings, which were in a way replicas of ruined churches or mosques or synagogues. And the idea of a sacred space means a great deal to me. And I think, even I'd mentioned Brian Stevenson or the idea of that kind of museum. I think that we can restore a sense of things being sacred, whether they're human rights or something. After all, sacred is not that different from the word sacrifice. And there's very few religions that don't have a martyr figure or the idea of a sacrifice where you give up your life for something larger. So my work is an attempt at offering within, as if it was a secular religious space, in which this would be my way of fulfilling a ritual, an observation, an offering. And even the burning, the tearing, the typing, it all goes into some of that kind of making.
Thank you. And Asher just said in the chat, that was a wonderful answer.
Well, I'm grateful, but let me just add to it one thing, which is that there are very few art forms that if you look at the various myths about how they came into being, whether it's music or painting, they involve a kind of visitation from a god. We have Hermes invents the lyre, or Apollo plays the lyre. What is our sense that an artistic medium could be more than just an aesthetic thing, but could be mediumistic, right? Could put us in touch with the way at a seance, you might have a medium who puts you in touch with something that is not empirically in front of you, but can have tremendous force. So can paintings be mediums in that sense as well? We speak of modernism as, oh, this is when the medium became the important thing. But I'm wanting to think of the medium in this other more primal sense of it being mediumistic. And certainly for dealing with some of, a lot of what we've been going through in these years where you feel you almost need a mediator. Who can mediate between the self and the kind of violence that you're seeing out there? And so traditionally one would have gone to pray at the feet of a Christ figure, or you'd appeal to a God. So I'm driven by those impulses, but I don't have the repose of a steady object of belief. It's more a practice.
That's great. I mean, it's interesting to hear a kind of sacralized object as a way of metabolizing the world, or
I think we need
digesting the
it.
world.
I think it used to be that the world was an enchanted place.
Mm-hmm.
And we, after the age of reason, we disenchanted it, basically. We said, no, there's rational explanations for all of that. This is just, and then it becomes physics and chemistry. But what happened to that sense of, my God, I can't just go chop down that tree without realizing that there might be a spirit in it. Now we're finally, by science, making our way back to understanding things like the intelligence of creatures and vegetation and so on. But yeah, maybe I'm an animist at heart.
I think Jung says something about the privilege of fearing demons instead of like climate change or something. So we are now going to conclude with final remarks from our publisher and artistic director, Phong Bui. You should be able to unmute yourself, Phong.
Good. I wanted to just shout out a thank you to Phong and to say that this has been a nice return, because my very first New York show, after the couple of Paris shows, one of the reviews was actually in the Brooklyn Rail. So it's nice to be coming back after all these years. And I really appreciate what you do, especially at the intersection of so many arts and senses of the public.
In fact, I never met Jory, but first time that I came to Italy on a traveling grant in '87, Barbara Rose took me, our dear friend who passed recently, brought me to meet Bill and Beverly Pepper in a grand villa in an incredible, amazing party. Everyone was there. I believe that Fellini and his wife was there too. It was amazing. At any rate, it's a small circle that returns. So thank you, Phyllis and Peter, for a wonderful conversation here. Just following what Ty said earlier about the environment that you try to create, that inhabit you or you inhabit it, remind me so much of certain kind of artists. Not all. Some artists can live with a certain mental space within. You know, you can imagine someone like Giacometti during the war would travel to Italy, have a studio, and he would make tiny little sculptures that could fit in big box matches, you know?
Yes.
Whereas, for example, thinking about the Republic, your triptych there, even though, you know, one can detect certain quasi-identifiable images, certainly on occasion, such as building appearing below, for example, and yet the gesture of the form moving freely across the picture plane, which evoke a sense of lyrical improvisation.
Yes.
At the same time, they're very physical, which remind me so much of how de Kooning, who once he left New York, you know, whereas the urban abstraction was so compressed, very claustrophobic, one could say. But once he moved to Montauk, the space opened up slowly, and I'm thinking very particular period, which is the 70s.
Yes.
After he visited Italy, and things opened up. There's one painting that reminds me so much of Republic, which is his famous, whose name was written in water, which is the epitaph of Keats' tomb in Rome.
Yes.
And I'm thinking of that in the sense how overtly the impermanence of being or existence in that painting were to me the liquid. But how you able to use color is a question that I want to ask very much, even though we know it's fabric, but it's nevertheless, it's color.
Yes.
And it's color mostly, we know, easily, you know, deploy in order to construct. This is where the separation from previous artists who make collages, whether Kurt Schwitter, you came up from Cubism, the space, whereas in the way in which you use color, it's not optical.
Correct.
So my question is two questions combined to one. First is the location, the surrounding, how susceptible are you? That it might, you know, have some kind of reference to how you make the images. And secondly, color as a way to construct the form instead of being optical.
Yeah, no, those are very complex and powerful questions. And I'm glad you mentioned de Kooning and the late de Koonings, because there is a way in which when he freed up and those Montauk paintings, it's as if they're ribbons of color. And there's a kind of free flowing quality getting out from the more compressed earlier work, and a sense of liberation and oxygen in those works. And I certainly wanted a work like Republic to have a similar flowing, even though the winds were harsher and objects were more corrugated and weren't as free to blow as they feel in the de Kooning. But the color, of course, has associative strengths for me. And I think that there's something about using color as it comes to me from fabrics that means I have to respect what pre-exists me. I have to find these in the world the way I have to find color in the world, and bring that in as if not just by a work of will, but by kind of imagining into existence these things which are around. But if we noticed them and if we could compose them, we could make a color composition, right? So there's that aspect of discovery rather than saying, well, I know red, it's a cadmium red and it's in this tube, or it's an alizarin, and where it's all sort of pre-established. There's a sense of, oh, I'm finding color out in the world in things. And so that brings a kind of emotional, whether it's warmth or fear or blood or water or those kinds of elements. And they do take then, of course, compositional values. The color might be a big turquoise form, but it's going to move from one side of a triptych to another. So it still has some of that de Kooning-like function.
Yeah, the early painting, Peter, you know, the red and the blue that Philip was talking an hour ago, of course, it's reference for me so much of early Rauschenberg too.
Yes.
You know, the early 50s.
Yes.
So much leading to the famous erased de Kooning drawing. But
Yeah.
I'm thinking, you know, he's born in Port Arthur, Texas, and he had gone to school in Black Mountain College. So he had that cross-pollination or cross-disciplinary as you do.
Yes.
Interesting to me when he began to do the collage painting or the combined paintings, the application of colors and the way that things were put together, it seems as if he might have seen in the backyard of African Americans, you know, household where things clutter and put together, and there's certain kind of very anarchistic sense of enjoyment and color the same. So I'm just trying to figure out where.
No, this is very crucial. First of all, Black Mountain and that whole set of aesthetics that emerges out of that moment, whether it's in architecture or in painting or in music or in poetry, has been very important to me. But the Rauschenberg, I mean, what I feel I'm doing is, instead of combining strictly, I'm actually first having to transform, mangle, alter altogether the ingredients that I then combine. And I will layer them one on top of the other on top of the other. So it's not just traditional juxtaposition. It's more this kind of effect. And there's part of your remarks that are just slipping my mind, but I know that when you were saying something, I thought, aha, yes. And now it's just gone over my left shoulder. So can I retrieve something that you might have said that I've not picked up?
Yeah, it's just a sense of, I guess, in terms of overall treatment, in a way, in the spatial sense, you know. I think that the recent work is really, as Phyllis pointed out, it's lyrical.
Yes.
It have a sense of expansion. So it's not really all, you know, like early one where it was so composed and very rectilinear structure that echoing the.
I just remembered what it was that I had been invited to think about due to your comments, and it was, you know, growing up in South Africa, one was aware also of poor improvised dwellings or shelters that would put together things like a piece of corrugated iron, some magazine covers on the wall, a piece of old curtaining that was then being repurposed to put over a table, and that sense of both poverty, fragility, but then yielding a kind of imaginatively rich composition. And of course, Rauschenberg was, was a revolutionary artist in a way. But then if we think back to figures like Thornton Dial or Jack Whitten or the African-American artists tradition, there's this fantastic use of, which is in a way a sort of American version of arte povera in some respects. But these are very many tributaries that flow into my particular mess of a river.
Right. Thank you for the massive river, Peter.
Yeah. Right. Well, maybe I should say ocean, since I'm always heading towards the ocean.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Back to you, Henry.
Thank you, Fang.
Yeah, thank you, Fong, and thank you so much to Peter and Phyllis. Thank you to everyone who asked questions today. And before we go over to the poet, I guess I should just remind everyone that Peter's show, Republic, is at Spur on Westwater, and I believe it closes March 20th.
I think that is the right date, yes. Okay. And I loved the remark of somebody saying they wanted to put their nose in there, because that's as close as I want you to get. I want these paintings to work from far away, but I really want them to be right up in your face as well.
Let's all put our noses in the paintings, but with our masks on, maybe. Yeah. All right, at the Brooklyn Rail, we have a tradition of ending lunch with a poem. We've carried that into these community events, and today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Daniel Bouchard, to the stage. Daniel Bouchard's most recent books are Spider Drop from Sub Press and Art and Nature from Ugly Duckling Press. His poems in progress examine received history and scrutinize it as manifested in painting, poetry, film, music, and monuments. He is a long-distance walker and an amateur book restorer, and he curates the Liminal Reading Series in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and works in academic publishing. The floor is yours, Daniel, and you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you for having me here today. I really enjoyed that presentation with Peter and Phyllis. It's been said 3 times now, but I was thinking throughout the entire thing that I would really love to get within inches of all of those works to really get a better view. So thank you for that. I think I have a couple of things here that might dovetail on maybe some of the themes of those works. I'm going to skip titles because anyway, I can't remember the name of the song. I played it endlessly for weeks. I played it endlessly for weeks one winter, looking out my bedroom window at falling snow. Record player close enough to just lift the arm and set the needle down again. The window overlooked the alley, and across the alley, the back of row houses, with some windows lit and some windows dark in the afternoon dark of snowstorm. And beyond the wall of interrupted brick, I could see the darker dark of creek woods. I played the song endlessly. Each time it ended, I played it again. It snowed for weeks. In memory, snow falls endlessly, and snow falls to that song. When winter sky is dark with storm, the song pulls me into sky, and the snow falls. Almost to the point of shaking, I wonder what I am doing with poetry, aware of a failure and more possible failure of not continuing, since everything in poetry is failure by default. The snow made bigger in memory, the storm longer in memory, even the quality of the song changed. I don't remember when the last survivor of the Ludlow massacre died. A story online disappeared, and I don't remember when. I don't remember the type of shoe, unscripted and airborne, the president ducked when visiting Baghdad. Threads of history surround us, some thick like steel cables, some like gossamer, living tissue. Oil rises from the harbor bottom where the bombed ship sank at its mooring, beside the memorial to lost lives. I don't remember the name of Cindy Sheehan's son. No one wants to talk about the Iraq War, and history might say why, but like William said, you got to ask hard. Things I don't remember derived from things I didn't know and places I've never seen, compounded by items I may have read or heard and now struggle to remember. I think I remember pallets of cash, billions of dollars flown to Baghdad early in the invasion, wrapped with stretchy plastic that any warehouse worker would recognize, and nylon straps to keep the piles from toppling. And all that money just vanished into rucksacks and suitcases and duffel bags of officials and gangsters, con men and hitmen. History is written. That's why Bic gave us ink after the animals were named and nicknamed. Writing brings history to mind, and death is a form of forgetting, surely the highest form, and much ends as flotsam in a racing tide. If the past were stones on the ground, bedrock outcroppings, and gradations of mineral and gravel, how is my relationship explained by walking home at the end of the day? In Scorsese's greatest scenes, we seem to see audiences of the world, more or less at the moments they suffer nostalgic toxicity. Aghast at gun pulling or glorious confession, are the punches swung with meaning deeper than the medium can make? How masculinity writhes as bodies fall, how the frame celebrates refusal to celebrate criminality of a tough guy zinger. Theater exit signs glow with the banality of safety. From the vantage of life's losers, some are struggling for cash. In the viewfinder, the eyepiece sees the immaterial conditions of existence. Some are loaded with cash, struggling. Many armed with power, many armed, many desiring to be. Who are the losers to those losers? The victims of losers. The glass eye is made to watch grass thicken or reflect dry paint. One should hear breezes, then endure soundtracks that guide emotions. There are so many cameras in the world. The idea Benjamin West could illustrate better than write sentences was Benjamin West's idea. He said so in a letter, and had he followed through, remarkable collections of illustrated memorandum might be around. Instead, we have Charlie Russell's letters and a mild lament for lost possibilities. Instead, we have the mineral scent of muddy water, steam from engines rising in the valley, gray-clad people milling about the riverbank, attention drawn to the wall, accompanied by clacking dishes, murmuring of both workers and diners, half-drowned mood-setting music, and the smell of meals cooked, oysters on ice, rolls and coffee, liquor and flowers, beer and the busyness of moving through an evening. The care in the pencil lines of Alan Crite, who he sees, how, where he is at all, about the work about what that work is, words to accompany illustrations. The organ for creation must be metaphysical, care and attention, mind and spirit, a metaphor. This title is Farragut and Bryant Park. The moment becomes funereal, moving eerily about. Then things get real. Surfaces explode in splinters, about to become surreal, moving about as in a dream. As the 12-year-old kid remembered, midship, active duty midshipman, bombarded off Valparaiso. He wrote of it in old age. He recalled associates later who chortled at his recollection of battles, death, ruin, privations of war among civilians. He strode out of the back room of the grocer while the Cracker Barrel crowd tittered and called him a croaker. He fled the southern city in compulsory service for the Confederacy, not unlike the captain some generations on who edelweissed his way out of the Anschluss up and over the Alps. Morisot's kids are suggestions of kids, and the ground beneath them suggests topography. But the sheets hung to dry really are wet, and the boats beside the quay at Cherbourg float on thick water, and the face of a child's mother and the possible hill they stand on are like the white flowers, and over the white flowers hang white sheets to dry like paintings in the wind. In a green field, there are less flowers. That means my reading's done. In a green field, there are less flowers, less figures, and even the chairbacks seem ground in the gravel path. A landscape ground out of clumps of herbage and gravel with vaporless air in the lungs, stalling bubbles in amber. I'm going to respect my timer. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was a really beautiful reading. And thank you, Peter. Thank you, Phyllis. It was wonderful to hear you in conversation today. And I'm looking forward to rewatching this on YouTube when it's uploaded in a couple days. At the Brooklyn Rail, we are celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. So please consider making a contribution to our anniversary fundraising campaign to keep the Rail and our special projects free, relevant, and independent, like this New Social Environment Conversation series and our special project, We the Immigrants. Every amount matters to us, and check out the chat for more information, where I'll post a link or ask one of our team members. And please join us on Monday at 1 p.m. when artist and jazz musician Jason Moran joins Rail publisher and artistic director Fong Hui for a conversation, which will conclude with a performance from poet and musician Janice Lowe. And I'm now going to unmute you all so you can say your goodbyes on your way out. And there, you should be able to unmute. Thank you so much again, Daniel, Phyllis, Peter.
Thank you.
Today was brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thanks,
Peter.
Peter and Phyllis.
Thank you.
So
Thank
much,
you, Daniel.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Phyllis. This is amazing. I really can't wait to go see the show.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
very much for
Henry.
taking your time.
Thank you.
Daniel, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much. Now we have to go to see the show.
Yes.
I had
you,
to
Peter.
see it, so
Thank
go
you.
lunch and go to see the show right away, ASAP.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Peter. Congrats.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phyllis. Well,
Thank you,
you all
Phyllis.
have a great weekend.